When you imagine a barber today, you likely think of a tidy shop, a striped pole turning lazily in the breeze, the sound of scissors clicking and the smell of shaving cream. But in the Middle Ages, stepping into the chair of a barber meant more than just getting a haircut or shave. It could also mean submitting yourself to bloodletting, having a tooth pulled, or even having a wound stitched together with steady hands that have been trained more by practice than by science. You, sitting in that chair centuries ago, would not have thought of a doctor in the modern sense. Physicians existed, yes, but they were often expensive, educated in Latin, and more concerned with theory than with your festering cut. For ordinary people, barbers were the men who held the tools, and those tools could just as easily trim your beard as slice into your vein. The barber's toolkit was both simple and terrifying. A razor, sharp enough to shear hair, doubled as an instrument for making small incisions. A brass bowl collected blood during procedure, and clean cloths were tucked nearby to wipe, bandage, or cover wounds. Barbers also carried scissors, tweezers, and needles, not delicate surgical steel, but sturdy implements that could handle both fabric and flesh. The iconic barber's pole itself is said to have originated from this dual role. The red and white stripes represented blood and bandages. Customers grasped the pole while their blood drained into a basin below. The next time you pass one of those poles, imagine not just a haircut, but veins open to release the so-called bad humors thought to cause illness. In medieval medical thought, disease was explained through the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of one humor was believed to cause illness, and barbers were often called upon to correct that imbalance. Bloodletting became the most common treatment. If you had a fever, you were bled. If you were sluggish, you were bled. If you had headaches or indigestion, bled again. The amount depended on the illness, and sometimes on astrological charts that guided where and when to open a vein. Imagine yourself walking into a dimly lit shop. The barber prepares a basin, sharpens his razor, and ties a cloth tightly around your arm. He opens a vein with practiced confidence. Blood flows. You may feel dizzy, perhaps faint, yet you believe this process is drawing illness out of your body. You are calmer afterward, convinced that health has been restored, because this was what you were taught to believe. Beyond bloodletting, barbers also pulled teeth. A decayed molar was not treated with filling or repair. It was simply extracted. The barber would grip a pair of iron pliers and wrench the tooth free, often with no anesthesia beyond a stiff drink or a wooden stick to bite. Barbers also handled abscesses, lance boils, and stitch cuts. Soldiers returning from skirmishes relied on them to bind wounds quickly. Farmers who injured themselves in the fields came to barbers for help. The line between barber and surgeon blurred, and in fact, for centuries the term barber-surgeon described this dual occupation. The barber shop was a place not just for grooming, but for conversation and community. Much like today, men gather to talk, exchange news, and relax. Yet underneath that casual atmosphere was a sense of trust in the barber's hands. He could hold a razor against your throat and shave you clean, or open a vein to release illness. For poorer folk, barbers were the only accessible healthcare providers. Physicians served nobles and the wealthy, but the barber was affordable, approachable, and local. This meant that barbers, though technically craftsmen, carried the weight of life and death decisions every time they picked up their tools. The relationship between barbers and the church was complicated. During the Middle Ages, monks often acted as physicians within monasteries, practicing both spiritual and physical healing. But in 1163, the church forbade clergy from performing surgery. This opened the door wider for barbers to take on those roles, since monks had often doubled as barbers themselves. Barbers thus inherited a role left vacant by religious orders. They provided the physical care that monks could no longer offer. Over time, this elevated their position in daily life, even if they were never considered true physicians. By the late medieval period, barbers began to organize into guilds, professional associations that regulated training, prices, and practices. These guilds distinguished between barbers who only cut hair and those who practiced surgery. The Company of Barber Surgeons in London, founded in 1540 under King Henry VIII, formalized this distinction. The union of the barber's practical skills with surgical duties gave rise to one of the earliest forms of regulated healthcare in Europe. Yet even then, barber surgeons were viewed as practical men, not intellectuals. Physicians studied at universities. Barber surgeons worked with their hands. Picture yourself again sitting in the barber's chair, not for a trim but for treatment. The shop is small, dimly lit by tallow candles. The air carries the smell of soap, sweat, and iron. The barber ties a cloth around your arm. You steady yourself by gripping a pole, watching the flame flicker as the razor slices. A bowl fills slowly beneath you. To you, this is not frightening. It is routine. Neighbors have undergone the same. The barber's steady presence, his firm voice, his practiced movement, all reassure you. You may leave weaker from loss of blood, but you also leave believing you are healed. Though the science was flawed, the barber's work was not entirely useless. Bloodletting occasionally relieved high blood pressure or reduced symptoms temporarily. Tooth extraction, though painful, removed sources of infection. Wound stitching and cleaning prevented death from blood loss. In their own way, barber surgeons provided care that kept communities alive. They filled a vacuum between scholarly physicians and ordinary people, blending grooming, medicine, and surgery into one strange but essential profession. And so, the medieval barber was more than a man with scissors. He was a surgeon, a healer, and sometimes the only lifeline available to ordinary people. His striped pole stood as a symbol not just of haircuts, but of blood, wounds, and recovery. Yet this is only the beginning. Because the story of barber surgeons is not just about daily practice, but about the uneasy tension between hands-on craft and scholarly medicine, between trust and suspicion, and between healing and harm. If Section 1 introduced you to the barber's chair as a place of both grooming and bloodletting, Section 2 must bring you into the broader world, the uneasy space where barber surgeons try to secure recognition, clash with physicians, and carve out their peculiar role in medieval society. In medieval Europe, medicine was not one uniform profession, but a layered hierarchy. At the top stood the university-trained physician. He was fluent in Latin, studied ancient Greek and Roman texts, and steeped himself in Galen, Hippocrates, and later Avicenna. The physician's tools were books and theory. His treatments often involved diagnosis through astrology, diet prescriptions, and the balancing of humors. Below him stood the surgeon, whose role was seen as manual, almost mechanical. Surgeons performed amputations, lanced abscesses, and dealt with injuries from war. Surgery required touch, precision, and a tolerance for blood. Yet because it was considered manual labor, surgeons were looked down upon by physicians, who prided themselves on intellect rather than craft. And at the lowest rung stood the barber, whose roots were in grooming, not medicine. But when the church forbade clergy from performing surgery in the 12th century, barbers stepped in. They had the tools, they had steady hands, and they had access to the public. From this opportunity emerged a barber surgeon, bridging the gap between haircutter and healer. By the 13th and 14th centuries, barber guilds began to organize across Europe. These guilds often split into two factions: the short row barbers who cut hair and shaved beards, and the long row barber surgeons who performed medical procedures. In London, for example, two separate guilds existed for a time: the Fellowship of Surgeons and the Company of Barbers. Their rivalry reflected broader tensions. Were barbers merely craftsmen with razors, or could they truly claim the mantle of healer? It was King Henry VIII who, in 1540, forced the two into a union, the Company of Barber Surgeons. This merger gave barber surgeons greater legitimacy, but also solidified the division between intellectual physicians and practical surgeons. Barbers, despite their bloody work, were never allowed to prescribe complex treatments. Physicians often scorned barber surgeons. To them, a man who sharpened razors and trimmed beards could never rise to the dignity of true medicine. Physicians accused barbers of being unlearned, unsophisticated, even dangerous. And yet, for ordinary people, physicians were distant and costly. They quoted Galen in Latin while charging high fees. By contrast, the barber was accessible, familiar, and affordable. He worked in the marketplace, in the town square, or along the village street. He spoke your language. He was part of your community. This created a tension that lasted for centuries. Physicians held authority in theory, but barber surgeons held trust in practice. The barber surgeon's training was not academic, but practical. An apprentice learned by watching, then by assisting, and finally by performing under supervision. His knowledge came not from books but from repetition. Cutting, binding, bleeding, stitching. This hands-on approach meant that barber surgeons often became skilled, even if their treatments were rooted in flawed medical ideas. A steady hand could save a soldier's life on the battlefield far more effectively than a physician's recitation of humoral theory. Some barber surgeons grew famous for their skill. Ambrose Père, a French barber surgeon of the 16th century, revolutionized battlefield medicine by abandoning boiling oil cauterization in favor of gentler treatments. His discoveries saved countless lives and showed that barber surgeons could indeed push medicine forward. For villagers, the barber surgeon was a constant presence. Beyond shaving and haircuts, he was called to homes to bleed the sick, to towns to tend soldiers, to churches to treat pilgrims. His work spanned both the ordinary and the extraordinary. Picture him walking through a muddy street, tools wrapped in cloth, summoned to stitch a child's wound or lance a farmer's boil. The people did not call a physician. They called him. He was affordable, quick, and practical. And yet, his work always carried risk. Bloodletting could weaken rather than heal. Tooth extraction could spread infection. Stitches could fester. Still, people returned because the alternative was no treatment at all. The barber's pole, with its red and white stripes, became the universal sign of the profession. Red for blood, white for bandages, and the pole itself for the staff patients gripped during bloodletting. Some poles also included blue, especially in later centuries, possibly representing veins, or, in America, patriotism. But in medieval Europe, the sight of a striped pole outside a shop meant one thing. Inside, a man could shave you, bleed you, or stitch you, depending on your need. This symbol gave barber surgeons both visibility and legitimacy. It reminded communities that help was at hand, even if imperfect. As barber surgeons gained importance, authorities began to regulate them. Guilds set standard for training. Kings granted charters. In cities like Paris and London, barber surgeons became semi-official medical providers, filling gaps left by physicians. Yet this legitimacy never erased the stigma. Physicians continued to view them as inferior. Universities barred them from study. In paintings and literature, barber surgeons were depicted as rough, bloody, and unrefined compared to the noble physician in his robes. The barber surgeon lived in two worlds, essential to people, scorned by the elite. It is important to remember that medicine in the Middle Ages was always shadowed by death. Infection was rampant. Anesthesia did not exist. Antibiotics were centuries away. Every cut risked sepsis. Every tooth pulled risked swelling that could close the throat. Every bleeding risked fainting, weakness, or death. And yet, barber surgeons carried on, because people had little choice. They turned to him not out of blind faith, but because he was there, he was affordable, and sometimes his rough methods worked. The barber surgeon of medieval Europe stood at a crossroads, between hair and healing, between craft and science, between respect and ridicule. He was not a physician, yet he saved lives. He was not an intellectual, yet he carried knowledge in his hands. The story of the barber surgeon is not just about tools and bloodletting. It is about a profession struggling for dignity in a world where healing itself was uncertain. But the story does not end here. Because in the centuries to come, barber surgeons would face profound changes, wars, plagues, and the eventual rise of modern medicine. Their role would shrink, their identity split, and their legacy buried beneath hospitals and universities. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the barber surgeon stood at a crossroads. For centuries, he had been both a practical healer and a craftsman of hair. His striped pole spun in marketplaces, a sign to villagers that someone within could cut their hair, shave their beards, bleed them of sickness, or stitch their wounds. Yet as the centuries turned, his world began to shift. The barber surgeon, once central to rhythms of daily life, would slowly lose his medical authority and return to the smaller, safer world of grooming. The 16th and 17th centuries brought change. Universities expanded their reach, and with them came more physicians, more books, and more study of the human body. The Renaissance revived interest in anatomy, and men like Andreas Vesalius published detailed drawings of the human form. Physicians who once spoke only in theories began to dissect bodies, peeling away layers of superstition. Surgery, too, began to change. No longer the rough craft of lancing and stitching, it started to emerge as its own discipline. The battlefield pushed its development, with wars producing countless wounded soldiers in need of treatment. Surgeons refined their techniques, and slowly their status rose. For barber surgeons, this shift was dangerous. Their role had depended on the blurry line between grooming and healing, but now medicine was drawing sharper boundaries. Surgeons claimed dignity as specialists, physicians claimed authority through study, and barber surgeons risked being left behind. The decline of the barber surgeon was not sudden, but gradual. In England, the Company of Barber Surgeons, formed in 1540 under Henry VIII, held together for nearly 2 centuries. But by the 18th century, tensions grew. The surgeons wished to be free from association with barbers, whose work they saw as humble and unlearned. In 1745, the surgeons finally broke away, forming the Company of Surgeons, which would later become the Royal College of Surgeons. The barbers, meanwhile, returned to their original role, cutting hair, shaving beards, and tending to appearance rather than health. The split was symbolic of a broader trend across Europe. As medicine professionalized, as hospitals grew, and as scientific knowledge expanded, barber surgeons were pushed aside. Their role in bloodletting and simple procedures lingered, but their influence waned. Yet even as surgery professionalized, barber surgeons continued to perform bloodletting well into the 18th and 19th centuries. The practice, rooted in humoral theory, remained stubbornly popular. Doctors prescribed it, patients requested it, and barbers carried it out. In fact, bloodletting became so entrenched that it survived far longer than most medieval practices. George Washington, the first president of the United States, was famously bled multiple times during his final illness in 1799. This persistence gave barber surgeons a shadowed relevance, even as their surgical responsibilities faded. They remained the everyday practitioners of an outdated cure, slowly fading into irrelevance as new science emerged. Another blow came with the growth of hospitals. In the medieval world, care was often local: barbers in shops, midwives in homes, monks in cloisters. But from the 17th century onward, hospitals expanded, especially in urban centers. These institutions centralized care, placed it under trained physicians and surgeons, and pushed out community practitioners. In hospitals, barbers had little place. Their skills were practical but limited, and professional surgeons no longer wished to share space with them. What had once been a tolerated overlap became an exclusion. The barber's chair, once a place of healing, became only a place of grooming. Still, the barber surgeon left an enduring mark on culture. The barber's pole, with its red and white stripes, remains to this day, a faint echo of a time when razors drew blood as often as they shaved hair. In literature, the barber surgeon often appeared as a rustic healer, a figure of both comedy and necessity. In paintings, he is depicted leaning over bowls of blood, stitching wounds with rough precision, or extracting teeth with pliers. These images remind us of a world where healing was communal, messy, and far removed from sterile hospitals. Even as their role faded, the memory of barber surgeons lingered in symbols, stories, and language. By the 19th century, barber surgeons were all but gone. The professions had fully separated. Barbers cut hair, surgeons operated, physicians prescribed. Science had advanced, germ theory explained infection, anesthesia eased pain, antiseptics reduced death. The barber who once stitched wounds now trimmed sideburns. His basin no longer filled with blood, but with soapy water. His razors no longer opened veins, but shaved chins. He had returned to the quieter, safer role of grooming, leaving medicine to those who had claimed it with books, hospitals, and universities. And yet, when you look back, you cannot dismiss the barber surgeons as mere pretenders. For centuries, they were the only accessible healers for ordinary people. They stitched wounds, pulled teeth, and provided treatments when physicians were too costly or distant. Their work was imperfect, often dangerous, sometimes fatal, but it was also necessary. Without barber surgeons, countless soldiers, peasants, and townsfolk would have faced injury and illness with no help at all. In their bloody, rough, and practical way, barber surgeons kept communities alive through centuries of uncertainty. So the barber surgeon faded, his pole left as the last reminder of a strange profession where grooming met medicine. His decline tells us something important. That medicine, like history itself, evolves not in sudden leaps, but in gradual separations. Professions sharpen their boundaries, knowledge grows, and the old ways are slowly pushed aside. But perhaps there is a lesson here. 2. The barber surgeon reminds us that history is not only about great physicians, famous hospitals, or brilliant discoveries. It is also about the ordinary hands that held razors and scissors, binding wounds in small shops on muddy streets. The barber surgeon was never a great figure of medicine, but he was a necessary one. And in his quiet, bloody work, he bridged the gap between survival and science. If you picture medieval Europe, you might imagine knights in armor, monks bent over manuscripts, or peasants bent over fields. But there's another image you should hold. A woman stirring a great wooden vat, steam rising as barley and water mingle, the scent of yeast filling a dimly lit room. This was the alewife, the brewer of beer for her household, her neighbors, and sometimes her entire village. In the Middle Ages, beer was not a luxury. It was daily sustenance, safer than water, a source of calories, and a comfort in hard times. And though today brewing is often imagined as the work of great guilds or monasteries, in its earliest and most enduring form, it was women who brewed. They brewed in kitchens, in cottages, in barns. They brewed not as professionals, but as caretakers of survival. To understand the importance of ale, you must first imagine a world where clean water could not be taken for granted. Wells could be contaminated, rivers polluted by waste, and streams shared by animals and humans alike. Drinking water carried risk. Ale, by contrast, was boiled during brewing, fermented, and flavored with herbs or hops. The alcohol content was usually low, just enough to kill dangerous microbes and preserve the liquid for a short time. This small beer was consumed by men, women, and even children, not as recreation but as hydration. Imagine sitting down to a midday meal in a medieval village. Bread, perhaps some cheese or salted fish, and a mug of ale. It was not strong, not intoxicating, but it was safe. For the peasant laboring in the field, the craftsman in his workshop, or the housewife tending children, ale was as necessary as bread itself. The brewing process was laborious, but it followed a rhythm as familiar as baking bread. Grains, often barley, oats, or wheat, were soaked, sprouted, dried, and ground. The malt was mixed with water, boiled, and flavored with herbs known as grut before hops became common. Yeast, though poorly understood, worked its unseen magic, turning the mixture into ale. Aloe was brewed in small batches, often weekly. The work was done in great wooden vats, stirred with paddles, poured into casks, and served from their homes. A broom or ale stick might be hung outside the door, the signal that fresh ale was ready. Neighbors would gather, pay a few coins, and drink together in a space that was both domestic and communal. Brewing was, at its heart, women's work, an extension of the household duties of feeding, baking, and caring, just as women spun wool and baked bread. So they brewed ale, and just as bread will sustain life, so too did ale. For some women, brewing was simply for family use, but for others, it became a source of income. Selling ale from a home provided a rare opportunity for women to earn money in a world where economic roles were tightly restricted. Aloe was sold to neighbors, to workers after the fields, and sometimes even to travelers. In towns, women brewed larger quantities, supplying markets or taverns. The income supplemented household budgets, helped pay rents, and gave women a small measure of independence. But with this opportunity came scrutiny. Local officials monitored the quality and price of ale, sometimes sending ale tasters to ensure no brewer watered down a product or overcharged her customers. A woman who brewed poor ale could face fines or public shame. Brewing, then, was not just a craft but a regulated responsibility. The dominance of women in brewing may seem surprising today, when beer is often associated with men. But in medieval Europe, the household was the center of production, and women controlled the household. Alewives worked alongside bakers, spinners, and dairymaids as pillars of daily survival. In many ways, ale was considered another form of food, and brewing another form of cooking. Just as bread nourished, ale hydrated. Just as milk fed, ale comforted. Yet, because brewing brought money, women who brewed for sale entered a delicate balance. They crossed the line between household duties and public commerce, and that crossing sometimes exposed them to suspicion, envy, and ridicule. Over time, alewives began to be caricatured in literature and art. They were often depicted as greedy, dishonest, or bawdy. Plays and poems mocked the alewife who watered her beer, who cheated her customers, or who lured men with drink. Some historians even suggest that the later imagery of the witch, the woman with a cauldron, a pointed hat, and a cat, may have been influenced by the alewife's world. Alewives brewed in great kettles, sometimes wore tall hats to stand out in busy markets, and often kept cats to protect their grain from mice. What began as ordinary household brewing may have fed into centuries of suspicion about women's power and independence. Despite these stereotypes, alewives remained central figures in their communities. They provided not just drink, but a gathering place. Their homes became informal taverns, spaces where neighbors talked, laughed, and shared the news of the day. Picture a village evening. Men and women gathered in a smoky room, cups of ale in hand, the alewife bustling between vats and benches. The ale is not strong, but it warms the body and smooths conversation. In a world without newspapers or coffee houses, such gatherings spread information, built relationships, and wove the fabric of community life. It is true that monasteries also brewed, and later, taverns grew into formal businesses. But for much of the medieval period, brewing remained rooted in women's households. Monks brewed for their communities, but ordinary people depended on alewives. The tavern as we know it, male-run, commercial, and large-scale, would come later. For now, the alewife remained at the heart of daily life, her work invisible to history books yet essential to survival. The alewife brewed not for glory, but for need. Her kettles boiled with grain and water, her vats bubbled with yeast, and her home smelled constantly of malt. She fed her family, quenched her neighbors, and kept her village alive, one mug at a time. Yet her story is not so simple. For in the centuries to come, brewing would shift, moving from women's hands to men's, from kitchens to guilds, from households to commercial breweries. The alewife, once central, would be pushed to the margins, her image mocked, her role forgotten. If Section 1 introduced the alewife as the quiet keeper of daily drink, Section 2 must show how her place was challenged. For centuries, brewing was women's work, rooted in the household. But as towns grew, markets expanded, and profit entered the picture, the alewife found herself caught between opportunity and regulation, between community trust and public suspicion. In medieval England and much of Europe, ale was considered a necessity. Because it was essential, governments regulated it closely. Officials wanted to ensure that ale remained affordable for all, and that brewers did not exploit shortages or inflate prices. The assize of bread and ale, first codified in 1266, set rules for both quality and price. Just as bread was weighed and measured, so too was ale tested. Ale tasters, local officials, often chosen annually, were appointed to visit brewers' homes. They sampled the ale, judged its strength, and ensured the price was fair according to the cost of grain. For the alewife, this meant scrutiny. If her ale was too weak, too watery, or too expensive, she could be fined. Records from manorial courts list countless women punished for breaking the assize of ale. Sometimes the fine was small. Other times, repeated offenses brought public shaming. Yet despite these penalties, alewives kept brewing, because demand never ceased. The court records of medieval villages tell us much about the prominence of alewives. Again and again, women's names appear in fines for brewing and selling ale at improper prices. In fact, the sheer number of cases suggests not failure, but persistence. Women brewed, sold, were fined, and then brewed again. It was a cycle. Brew, sell, get caught, pay the fine, return to brewing. Ale was too vital, and the profits too necessary, to stop. The fines were often treated as a kind of informal tax, one that local officials could rely on, because alewives would never abandon their kettles. This also shows how visible alewives were. Unlike farming or spinning, brewing spilled into public life. A woman who sold ale was a known figure, a face of the village economy. Yet with visibility came vulnerability. As women stepped into public markets, they attracted suspicion. Aloes were sometimes mocked in plays, poems, and songs as greedy or dishonest. They were accused of watering down their ale, using poor grain, or charging unfairly. One popular medieval poem, The Tunning of Eleanor Rumming by John Skelton, 1521, describes an alewife in grotesque terms, "Oh, dirty," serving foul drink in a filthy house. Whether or not this reflected reality mattered little. It cemented an image of alewives as unscrupulous. This caricature grew sharper over time. As men began to take over brewing through guilds and taverns, women were further sidelined by reputation. The dishonest alewife became a cultural stereotype, justifying the transfer of authority from women's households to male-dominated institutions. By the late Middle Ages, brewing shifted from household craft to regulated profession. In towns, brewing guilds began to form, often excluding women or making their participation difficult. These guilds controlled prices, production, and membership, ensuring that brewing became a recognized male trade. In rural villages, alewives remained dominant longer, but the tide was turning. As brewing became more profitable, especially with the rise of hop beer in the 14th and 15th centuries, men increasingly took control. What had once been women's work and necessity was now an economic opportunity men wished to claim. The transition was gradual but steady. By the 16th century in much of Europe, brewing had largely shifted to men, though alewives lingered in smaller communities. The introduction of hops into brewing played a major role in this shift. Hop beer, originating in Germany and spreading westward, lasted longer than traditional ale brewed with gruit. This meant it could be transported, stored, and sold in larger markets. Hop beer required larger-scale production and greater investment. It moved brewing beyond the household vat and into breweries designed for commerce. This scale was beyond most alewives, who brewed small batches for local consumption. Thus, the shift from ale to beer was also a shift from women to men, from local to commercial, from household to marketplace. One of the most intriguing, if debated, aspects of alewife history is the overlap with witch imagery. Some historians argue that the stereotype of the witch, pointed hat, cauldron, broom, and cat, may have originated from the alewife. Alewives brewed in large kettles that resembled cauldrons. They hung brooms or ale sticks outside their homes as signs of fresh ale. They sometimes wore tall hats to stand out in crowded markets. And they kept cats to guard their grain against vermin. When brewing moved into male hands, these symbols, once innocent, could be twisted into signs of suspicion. The independent woman with her cauldron became a figure of ridicule or fear. The alewife, once essential, was reimagined as dangerous. While not all scholars agree with this interpretation, the parallels are striking. At the very least, the decline of the alewife and the rise of the witch stereotype occurred side by side, suggesting a cultural unease with women in public economic roles. Despite the pressures, many alewives continued their work quietly into the early modern period. For poor families, brewing remained a survival strategy. A woman who could brew decent ale ensured that her household had drinkable liquid, and that her family could earn a few extra coins. Even as guilds took control of cities, the countryside remained dotted with women who stirred vats and sold mugs of ale from their doorways. They may not have left great breweries or written records, but they left an imprint on daily survival. The alewife stood at the boundary of change. From hearth to market, from necessity to commerce, she carried the weight of both opportunity and suspicion. She was fined, mocked, regulated, and gradually replaced. Yet she persisted because communities needed her. But her world was shifting. The rise of hops, the growth of guilds, and the spread of taverns all pointed toward a future where brewing would belong to men, and the alewife would fade into memory or into caricature. By the end of the medieval period, the world that had once been ruled quietly by alewives was shifting beyond recognition. What began as women's household labor, boiling grain, fermenting liquid, selling cups to neighbors, was being reshaped into a male-dominated industry. Where once a broom outside a cottage door marked the presence of fresh ale, now tavern signs hung above commercial establishments. Where once women's hands stirred the kettles, now guild-trained brewers manage barrels destined for markets far beyond the village. The story of the alewife is not simply one of daily life. It is also a story of erasure, of how women's central role in brewing was pushed aside as beer became profit, politics, and prestige. The expansion of towns and the rise of long-distance trade transformed brewing. As hops replaced grit, beer could last longer, travel further, and fetch higher profits. Brewing was no longer tied to the short-lived, small batches of household ale. Instead, it became an enterprise requiring investment, storage facilities, and distribution networks. Men, already dominant in urban guilds, seized this opportunity. Breweries grew larger, taverns expanded, and brewing was professionalized. Women, once essential, were often excluded from guild membership, denied the capital needed for large-scale brewing, and gradually forced out of trade. The transformation was not just economic, but symbolic. Brewing shifted from a household necessity to a public business, and with that shift, it moved from women's domain to men's. As men gained control of breweries, the image of the alewife soured further. Plays and poems increasingly mocked her as dishonest, dirty, or drunk. The once respected provider of daily drink was recast as a figure of ridicule. Court records continue to show women fined for breaking ale regulations well into the 16th century, but these cases became fewer. By then, the alewife was less central. Her role reduced as taverns and breweries overshadowed her household kettles. In some places, especially in rural villages, women continued to brew into the 17th and even 18th centuries, but their presence was marginal, overshadowed by the dominance of male brewers. The alewife became a relic, remembered more for the stereotype than for her centuries of contribution. The rise of taverns played a central role in this transformation. Taverns were not just places to drink. They were centers of male social life, spaces of business, politics, and community decision-making. Unlike the alewife's kitchen, the tavern was public, visible, and organized. As taverns multiplied, the intimate, household-based brewing of women was replaced by institutions that belonged to men. Drinking shifted from domestic to commercial, from family-centered to male-centered. This shift also changed the meaning of beer itself. What had once been a daily staple of hydration and survival became increasingly tied to recreation, commerce, and public life. The household drink of women became the public drink of men. The decline of alewives was not simply a matter of economics. It also reflected deeper cultural currents. In a society where women's roles are confined to household, any sign of female independence, especially one tied to money-making, could be viewed with suspicion. Brewing gave women visibility, income, and a voice in community life. Its decline mirrored broader efforts to contain women's work within domestic spaces. The witch-like caricatures of alewives, the mockery in plays and poems, and the strict regulations all helped reinforce this boundary. Thus, the disappearance of the alewife from brewing history was not accidental. It was part of a larger process by which women were excluded from the public and economic spheres of European life. Yet the alewife never vanished completely. In rural areas, women continued to brew small batches for family and neighbors. Folk traditions of brewing survived, passed down through generations. In parts of Scandinavia, the Baltic, and even rural England, household brewing by women persisted quietly, far from the reach of guilds and towns. These women may not have been recorded in official histories, but they carried on a tradition that stretched back centuries. Their kettles boiled, their vats fermented, and their homes smelled of malt long after the alewife had disappeared from urban memory. Today, historians have begun to recover the forgotten role of women in brewing. Court rolls, poems, and guild records, once read as mere curiosities, now reveal a vibrant world of female labor. The broom outside the door, the cauldron in the kitchen, the coins earned from mugs of ale, all point to a history where women were central to the survival of communities. Modern craft brewing movements have also looked back to the alewife as a symbol. The recognition that women were the original brewers challenges the assumption that beer is, or ever was, a man's domain. The alewife story reminds us that history often hides the ordinary hands that sustain life, hands that stirred kettles rather than held quills. And so, the The alewife fades into history. From her household kettles came the drink that sustained medieval Europe. From her hands came survival for families and villages. Yet as brewing grew into commerce and power, she was mocked, regulated, and erased. Her story is not one of triumph, but of quiet resilience. She brewed because her family needed her to. She sold ale because her neighbors depended on her. And though she was pushed from the trade, her labor left its mark on centuries of daily life. Perhaps the next time you see a pint of beer, you will remember not just the brewery that produced it, but the countless women who once brewed in kitchens, stirring kettles with the same care they gave to bread and children. The alewife may be forgotten in the grand narratives of kings and wars, but in truth, she was one of the pillars of medieval survival. Salt, a substance so ordinary that you hardly notice it today, sprinkled on your food without thought, poured freely from shakers in restaurants, sold cheaply in every shop. But in the Middle Ages, salt was precious, so precious that kings taxed it, cities fought over it, and families depended on it for survival. A single pinch could season, preserve, and even define the politics of nations. When you imagine medieval life, think not only of bread and ale, but of salt. Without it, food spoiled quickly. Without it, meat and fish could not be stored for winter. Without it, cheese and butter could not be stabilized. Salt was not just flavor. It was preservation, survival, and wealth. And because it was so vital, rulers learned to control it. The story of salt is a story of power, taxation, and the burdens placed on ordinary people who needed it most. For the medieval peasant, salt was not a luxury seasoning. It was survival insurance. In an age without refrigeration, fresh meat lasted only days, fish spoiled quickly, and milk turned sour within hours. Salt preserved these foods, making them last weeks or months. A family might salt pork in autumn, storing it for winter when fresh food was scarce. Fishermen salted their catch so it could travel inland, feeding those far from coasts. Farmers used salt in making butter and cheese, stabilizing products that would otherwise rot. Even bread relied indirectly on salt, for salted butter or cheese made it more filling. In short, without salt, medieval diets would have been dangerously fragile. Salt was not evenly available across Europe. Coastal regions could extract it from seawater by boiling or evaporation in salt pans. Inland, it had to be mined from deposits or brine springs. Transporting salt over long distances made it expensive. Certain cities became famous for salt. Venice and Genoa controlled Mediterranean salt routes. In France, the marshes of Garonne supplied Atlantic markets. In Germany, Lüneburg salt works fed the Hanseatic League's trade. Inland, salt mines at Salzburg, literally the salt fortress, enriched bishops and emperors. Where salt was abundant, wealth followed. Where it was scarce, people paid dearly for every grain. In France, salt became the focus of one of the most infamous taxes in history, the gabelle. First imposed in the 14th century, the gabelle made salt a state monopoly. Everyone was required to buy a certain amount of salt from royal warehouses, at prices set by the crown. This meant peasants were forced to purchase salt whether they wanted it or not, and at inflated prices. For the poor, it was a crushing burden. Smuggling, known as faux sonnage, false salting, flourished as people tried to avoid the tax. Salt smugglers were hunted down, fined, and sometimes executed. The gabelle became so hated that centuries later, its memory fueled anger during the French Revolution. Ordinary people remembered how kings had turned a daily necessity into a tool of oppression. France was not alone. Across Europe, rulers recognized the value of salt taxation. In England, customs duties on imported salt filled royal coffers. In China, the salt monopoly had existed since ancient times, funding entire dynasties. In India, salt taxes became a tool of empire, lasting into the colonial era. Salt was the perfect commodity for taxation because it could not easily be substituted or foregone. People could avoid luxury goods, but not salt. The universality of its need made it a natural choice for governments seeking steady revenue. Imagine yourself as a medieval villager. You need salt to preserve pork through the winter, but the local lord or crown taxes it heavily. You scrape together coins to buy your required ration, knowing that without it, Your family may go hungry when snow covers the fields. Perhaps you are tempted by smugglers offering cheaper salt. Their sacks carried secretly through forests and across rivers. If caught, both you and they could face punishment. Yet the choice is stark. Pay the tax, risk starvation, or risk the law. Salt, in this sense, was more than a seasoning. It was a burden woven into every meal, every survival calculation, every household's budget. Salt was ordinary and yet extraordinary. A small pinch carried the weight of survival. A sack of it represented power, wealth, and control. Kings taxed it, merchants traded it, smugglers risked their lives for it, and ordinary families, day by day, paid the price. But this is only the beginning. For in the centuries that followed, the salt tax would spark rebellions, shape economies, and leave scars across nations. If Section 1 showed how salt was a necessity of daily survival, Section 2 must turn the way rulers learned to squeeze that necessity into coin. Salt, more than most goods, lent itself to monopoly and control. And where there is monopoly, there is smuggling. Where there is taxation, there is resentment. Across Europe, the history of salt became not only a history of preservation, but of power, resistance, and quiet rebellion. The appeal of salt for rulers was simple. Everyone needed it. Unlike luxury goods, which only the wealthy could afford, salt was universal. Kings and emperors realized that by controlling salt supplies, they could guarantee steady income. In France, the gabelle formalized this. Each province was required to purchase a fixed quantity of salt from the crown's warehouses. Even families who needed little were forced to buy, regardless of circumstance. This was not merely taxation. It was compulsion. The crown justified this as necessary for funding wars, maintaining armies, and governing the realm. But for ordinary people, the salt tax felt like theft embedded into their daily survival. The cruelty of the system lay not only in the tax itself, but in its inequality. France's gabelle divided the kingdom into regions, some with low taxes, others with crushingly high ones. A family in Brittany might pay a fraction of what a family in Anjou paid. This disparity fueled smuggling across provincial borders. Men carried sacks of salt at night through forests, rivers, and fields, seeking to sell in high-tax regions. These smugglers, called faux sonneurs, became folk heroes in some communities. They risked arrest, fines, imprisonment, or even execution, but they kept moving. The salt they carried was not exotic treasure. It was survival, priced unjustly high by the crown. Authorities responded harshly. Special brigades were formed to track smugglers. Villages were searched, sacks confiscated, households punished for hiding contraband salt. The salt tax was policed with zeal, usually reserved for treason. But smuggling could not be stopped. The incentive was too great, the need too universal. Across centuries, records tell of countless smugglers caught, fined, imprisoned, and yet others took their place. The war between crown and commoner over salt became a steady, grinding conflict. To grasp the depth of resentment, imagine a family again. Each year, they must buy their ration of salt at the royal storehouse. The price is inflated far above market value. The money they hand over might have gone toward better tools, more food, or repairs to their home. Instead, it lines the coffers of the crown. Meanwhile, they know that in another province, families pay far less for the same necessity. They hear whispers of smugglers who can provide salt at half the cost. They must choose, obey the law and suffer poverty, or defy it and risk punishment. This choice weighed on every household, every year, for centuries. In some places, resentment turned into revolt. Protests against salt taxes flared across Europe. In Spain, riots broke out when salt prices rose. In France, uprisings in the 16th and 17th centuries directly targeted salt warehouses and officials. These rebellions were not led by nobles or generals, but by ordinary villagers. They rose not over ideology, but over hunger, poverty, and salt. Even in later centuries, salt remained a rallying point. During the French Revolution, hatred of the gabelle was so strong that it was one of the first taxes abolished. The revolutionaries understood that resentment of the salt tax had simmered for generations, waiting for release. Salt taxation also reshaped trade. Merchants who transported salt were bound by royal licenses and tolls. Entire towns grew wealthy from their strategic position on salt routes, while others languished for lack of access. The Hanseatic League, that great network of northern merchants, depended heavily on salt. Lüneburg salt mines, paired with herring fisheries in the Baltic, created a powerful trade axis. Without salt, the preservation of fish staple food for much of Europe would have collapsed. In this way, salt was not only a domestic burden, but an international driver of wealth and conflict. What makes the story of salt unique is how it touched every life. A peasant, a merchant, a soldier, a monk, all needed salt. It flavored their meals, preserved their food, and lightened their labor. Yet at every turn, rulers sought to profit from this need. Imagine again the act of salting pork in autumn. The family gathers to rub coarse crystals into slabs of meat, packing it into barrels for winter. Each grain represents safety from hunger. Each handful, though, carries a memory of coins spent unwillingly at the tax collector's table. The very taste of food became a reminder of authority. The story of salt in the Middle Ages is the story of monopoly and resistance. Kings turned it into revenue, families turned it into survival, and smugglers turned it into defiance. Across Europe, salt carried not only flavor but also the weight of injustice. And yet, the tale is not complete. For in the centuries to come, salt would not only fund wars and spark smuggling, it would also shape empires, global trade, and even modern movements for independence. Salt began as a daily necessity, a preservative in every household. But by the early modern era, it had grown into something larger, a lever of empire, a trigger of rebellion, and a symbol of the tension between rulers and the ruled. The story of salt stretches far beyond medieval villages. It reaches into the age of global empires, and even into modern struggles for freedom. The economic power of salt was not confined to Europe. Across the world, states used salt taxation as a dependable source of revenue. In China, the salt monopoly stretched back centuries, possibly to the Tang dynasty and earlier. It provided dynasties with stable income, funding armies and infrastructure. The state controlled salt production and distribution, ensuring that every citizen who consumed salt contributed indirectly to imperial stability. In India, salt became a focus of both Mughal and later British rule. Under colonial administration, salt taxes were raised so high that they became infamous. For villagers, salt was both essential and burdensome, a reminder of distant rulers extracting wealth from daily life. In Africa, trans-Saharan trade routes carried not only gold but also salt. Caravans of camels transported slabs of salt across deserts, where it was as precious as gold. Cities such as Timbuktu thrived on this trade, salt functioning as currency as much as commodity. The universality of salt made it a pillar of empire building. To control salt was to control people. Returning to France, the gabelle remained one of the most hated institutions of the monarchy. Even after reforms in other areas, the salt tax endured. For centuries, the resentment smoldered. In villages, smugglers continued their trade, supported by communities who saw them as heroes against injustice. Court records are filled with stories of entire families punished for possessing untaxed salt. The salt tax was more than economic policy. It was a symbol of royal oppression. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, abolition of the gabelle became an early demand. Revolutionaries understood that grievances over salt were not abstract. They were felt in every household, every meal. In 1790, the gabelle was finally abolished, cheered by a populace that had endured its weight for generations. The story did not end in the 18th century. Even in the modern world, salt remained a flashpoint. In colonial India, the British salt monopoly became a tool of control. By taxing and regulating salt, the British extracted wealth while burdening villagers with costs on an everyday necessity. Resistance grew slowly but steadily. It culminated in 1930 with Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March, one of the most famous acts of nonviolent protest in history. Gandhi and his followers walked 240 miles to the sea, where they gathered salt in defiance of British law. This simple act, lifting a handful of salt, galvanized millions and exposed the injustice of colonial rule to the world. Salt, humble and ordinary, became the symbol of independence. Why did salt so often provoke such deep resentment? because it was unavoidable. Unlike luxury goods, salt could not be dismissed. Unlike grain, it could not be grown. Everyone needed it, poor and rich alike. That made taxation universal and inescapable. When rulers touched salt, they touched every life, every day. They placed their authority not only in laws and courts, but in kitchens and meals. The taste of food itself became a reminder of power. Today, salt is cheap, abundant, and almost invisible. You buy it without thought, sprinkle it without care. It sits in shakers, lost in the background of daily life. Yet history lingers in the memory of salt. The red and white slabs traded across deserts, the barrels salted in medieval villages, the taxes that burdened peasants, the smugglers chased through forests, the marches of Gandhi, all are reminders that even the smallest things can carry the weight of survival and politics. Salt was never just seasoning. It was a thread that tied households to empires, peasants to kings, and daily meals to the grand current of history. And so, a pinch of salt tells a long story. Of peasants preserving pork in wooden barrels, of smugglers carrying sacks through dark woods, of kings counting coins in treasuries, and of revolutionaries demanding justice. Salt shaped diets, economies, and empires. The next time you scatter on your food, imagine the weight it once carried. The power of kings, the burden on peasants, the rebellions it stirred. Salt may be ordinary today, but for centuries it was extraordinary, a mineral that shaped nations. When you imagine a medieval feast, you may picture golden goblets, long tables groaning under the weight of roasted boars, and nobles tearing into meat with jeweled daggers. But the truth of dining for most people was far simpler. Wooden spoons, pewter plates, coarse bread, and meals taken in cramped cottages. The everyday table of the medieval commoner was a place of modesty and necessity. It held not the extravagance of kings, but the essentials that sustained ordinary life. And though it may seem dull, the objects and rituals of this table tell us much about survival, community, and the quiet rhythm of existence in the Middle Ages. Most peasants' homes contained a single rough wooden table. It was not polished oak or carved mahogany, but a simple board supported by trestles. Around it, family members gathered on stools or benches, sometimes with no chairs at all. The table was multipurpose. It served for eating, working, mending tools, and teaching children. Meals were shared communally. Individual place settings were rare. Instead, food was placed in bowls or platters from which everyone helped themselves. This sense of sharing reflected both necessity and culture. The household survived as one, and the table reinforced that bond. The materials of dining depended on wealth. Nobles might own silver or gold, while prosperous townsfolk used pewter. Pewter, an alloy of tin and lead, was common in middle-class households, prized for its durability and dull shine. But it was not without risk. The lead content sometimes leached into food, causing slow poison that few understood. For the poor, wooden trenchers were more typical. A trencher might be a flat round board, or simply a thick slice of stale bread used as an edible plate. After the meal, the soaked bread could be eaten by the diner, fed to animals, or given to the poor. This practice of bread trenchers was practical, wasting nothing in a world where food scarcity was constant. Ceramic bowls and cups were also common, though often simple and unglazed. Clay vessels broke easily, but they could be replaced by local potters. The spoon was the universal utensil of the Middle Ages. Forks were rare, seen only in the courts of Byzantium or among the wealthy in Italy by the late medieval period. Knives were used, but often each person carried their own. The wooden spoon, carved from local trees, was a constant companion. Every household owned them. Every child grew up eating with them. They stirred pottages, scooped stews, and sipped broths. A well-worn spoon might be passed from parent to child, a small but essential inheritance. Imagine holding such a spoon, its surface smoothed by years of use, its handle darkened by oils from countless hands. It was not elegant, but it was intimate, an object that touched daily life more than any jewel or sword. The food itself reflected the simplicity of the utensils. Meals were dominated by bread, pottage, and ale. Bread, coarse and dark, was made from rye, barley, or oats. Pottage was a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat or fish. It simmered in a pot for hours, eaten day after day, its ingredients changing with what was available. Meat was rare for peasants, reserved for holidays or feasts. Fish, dried or salted, was more common, especially on fasting days prescribed by the church. Dairy, milk, butter, and cheese supplemented the diet. Meals were repetitive, plain, and sometimes monotonous, but they were reliable, sustaining bodies for long labor in the fields. Despite the simplicity, dining carried ritual. The meal began with a prayer. The father or eldest might serve first, dividing bread and ladling stew. Children learned patience, waiting their turn. Sharing bowls and trenchers required courtesy, taking modest portions, not hoarding, and leaving enough for others. Washing before and after meals was encouraged, though not always practiced. Basins of water might be passed around, hands dried on shared cloths. Table manners mattered, even in modest homes. No reaching across others, no drinking straight from the serving vessel, no wiping greasy hands on the table. These rituals reinforced order and community. The table was not only a place of eating, but of learning behavior, respect, and gratitude. Picture the scene: a dim cottage, lit by tallow candles or a fire in the hearth. The table stands uneven on an earthen floor. Steam rises from a single pot, filling the room with the scent of onions and barley. Family members lean close, spoons in hand, sharing bowls. Outside, the village sleeps. But here, the table glows as the center of warmth and life. It was not grand, not luxurious, but it was home. The commoner's table in the Middle Ages tells us much about a world built on survival. Pewter plates and wooden spoons may seem insignificant, but they were the tools of life. Around them gathered families who shared labor, meals, and faith in the face of hardship. And yet, the table was also a stage of change. Over time, as wealth grew and customs shifted, the objects of dining would evolve. Forks would appear, ceramics would spread, and bread trenchers would give way to plates. The commoner's table may have been simple, but it was never meaningless. Every meal reflected larger forces, religion, custom, and the slow changes of culture. Eating was not just about filling the stomach. It was about belonging to a community, observing sacred rules, and practicing rhythms passed down through generations. In medieval Europe, the church governed not only prayer, but also food. The calendar was filled with fasting days, feast days, and rules about what could and could not be eaten. Meat, for example, was forbidden on Fridays and during Lent. Fish became the substitute, salted or fresh depending on proximity to rivers and coasts. This meant that dining customs were directly shaped by the liturgical year. A peasant family might enjoy a bit of pork in autumn, but by spring they ate fish or pottage as Lent commanded. The church's rules entered the household not as abstract doctrine, but as the daily reality of what went on the wooden spoon. Monks and priests reinforced these customs. Sermons reminded parishioners of fasting obligations. Monastic hospitality spread certain foods, as monasteries offered travelers bread, ale, and fish. In this way, the rhythm of faith shaped the rhythm of meals. Yet if fasting limited meals, feasts expanded them. Villages marked holy days with communal celebrations, often centered on food. A feast might mean roasted meat, fresh bread, and ale served in abundance. Even the poorest participated, sharing in the collective joy of festival days. The utensils of feasting differed little from daily meals. Still wooden spoons, still trenchers, but the abundance transformed the atmosphere. A rare cut of meat carved at the table became a symbol of plenty. The sharing of pies, pastries, and sweetmeats echoed through memory long after the festival ended. Feasts reinforced not only religious devotion, but also social bonds. They reminded villagers that survival was not only individual, but collective. For centuries, forks were almost unknown in Europe. They existed in Byzantium and the Islamic world, but in the West, spoons, knives, and fingers sufficed. It was only in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance that forks began to appear among the wealthy, spreading slowly through Italy and France. At first, forks were mocked as unnecessary. Why use two prongs when fingers or knives could lift food just as well? Yet over time, forks became symbols of refinement. To use one was to show status, manners, and distance from the common table. For peasants, the fork was irrelevant for centuries. Their meals of pottage and bread required no prongs, only spoons and hands. The fork slow spread is a reminder of how cultural change often begins with elites before trickling down, if it trickles at all. The trencher of bread deserves closer attention. In many households, thick slices of stale bread were used as plates, absorbing juices and sauces. At the end of the meal, these trenchers were eaten, fed animals, or given to beggars. This practice blurred the line between plate and food. It also reflected the ethic of frugality. Nothing was wasted. A peasant could not afford to discard even a crust of bread. Every crumb carried the weight of labor, for grain had been grown, harvested, milled, and baked with effort. The bread trencher reminds us that eating in the Middle Ages was never separate from survival. Even the plate was part of the meal. Medieval dining also carried rules of courtesy, even for poor. Manuals of behavior instructed children not to wipe greasy hands on the table, not to speak with mouths full, and not to reach rudely across dishes. Though these rules were written for the gentry, their influence filtered downward. Families taught children patience at the table, respect for elders, and gratitude for food. To eat with others required self-control, sharing, and humility. The table, then, was a school of manners. It trained not only the stomach, but also the character. In villages, meals reinforced community bonds. Families often shared food with neighbors, particularly during hardship. A pot of pottage simmering on the fire might be stretched to include another mouth. During harvest, meals were shared communally in the fields. Alehouses, supplied by local brewers or alews, extended this communal dining into public life. Men gathered after work to drink, eat bread and cheese, and exchange news. Though simple, these gatherings wove the threads of community together. The act of eating together mattered as much as the food itself. The medieval table was more than wood, pewter, and spoons. It was a stage where religion, manners, and community all converged. Fasting shaped what was eaten. Feasts transformed how it was enjoyed, and daily rituals reinforced bonds of family and village. Though humble, these customs reveal the dignity of ordinary life. Around a wooden spoon and a trencher of bread, generations lived, learned, and shared. But the story is not complete. For in the final part, we must consider how the commoner's table evolved with time, how trade introduced new foods, how ceramics and forks spread, and how the table of the Middle Ages set the stage for the modern meal. By the late Middle Ages, the commoner's table was still marked by simplicity: bread trenchers, wooden spoons, clay bowls, and pewter plates for the slightly better off. Yet over the centuries, change crept in, slowly transforming the way ordinary people ate. These changes did not happen overnight, nor did they erase the modest rhythms of village meals. Instead, they layered new foods, new utensils, and new expectations upon the old patterns, setting the stage for dining as we know it today. By the 14th and 15th centuries, ceramic production expanded across Europe. Local potters made durable earthenware bowls and jugs, often with simple glazes that added color and made them easy to clean. Though fragile compared to wood or pewter, ceramics were affordable and could be produced in large quantities. For the peasant household, a set of glaze bowls or mugs represented a small step upward, an element of dignity at the table. A clay jug of ale or a brightly glazed bowl of pottage added a splash of color to otherwise dim cottages. These objects, though humble, signaled progress. The fork's gradual spread from Italy to France, and England continued through the Renaissance. At first, it was a curiosity of elites, dismissed by many as an affectation. But by the 17th century, forks began to trickle into wider use, even among prosperous townsfolk. For peasants, the fork was irrelevant for centuries longer. Their meals of thick stews, coarse bread, and porridge required spoons more than prongs. But as new foods like noodles, roasted vegetables, and refined meats entered diets, the fork became more practical. Its spread marks not just a change in utensil, but a change in the very nature of meals. The bread trencher slowly faded as wooden and ceramic plates became more common. By the 16th century, trenchers survived mostly in rural areas or among the very poor. Yet the symbolism of the trencher endured. It reflected a world where nothing was wasted, where food and plate blurred into one, and where survival shaped every custom. Its decline signaled a shift from necessity to convenience. Plates could be washed and reused. Bread could be spared for eating alone. This change reveals the gradual easing of scarcity, the slow rise of society able to separate utensil from meal. The late medieval and early modern periods introduced new foods to the commoner's table. Trade brought spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, though expensive. Even a trace could transform pottage. Sugar, once rare, trickled slowly into wider use. By the 16th century, the Columbian Exchange introduced potatoes, tomatoes, and maize, reshaping European diets forever. At first resisted or mistrusted, these foods eventually became staples. The potato, in particular, offered sustenance for peasants, rivaling bread as the foundation of meals. Each new food altered not only the diet, but the utensils and vessels needed to serve it. Stews thickened, breads diversified, and new drinks like tea and coffee in later centuries transformed the very culture of the table. As food changed, so too did the meaning of the table. In medieval cottages, the table had been multipurpose, workbench, desk, and eating place all in one. By the early modern period, wealthier households began to separate spaces, with tables increasingly dedicated to dining. This shift mirrored broader social changes. Dining became not just survival, but ceremony. The placement of plates, the serving of courses, and the order of eating reflected hierarchy and manners. Even among the commoners, echoes of this order filtered down. Who served first, who sat where, who spoke at meals. The table was no longer just a board of wood. It was becoming a stage of status. Yet amid all these changes, much remained the same. In small villages, families still gathered around rough boards, still used wooden spoons, still drank ale from clay mugs. Scarcity continued to shape meals, famine still loomed in bad harvest years, and frugality was never far from mind. The spread of forks, ceramics, and spices touched the countryside slowly, if at all. For many, the medieval table endured well into the 18th century. Progress in dining was uneven, marked more by geography and wealth than by time. The story of pewter plates and wooden spoons is not one of glamour. It is a story of survival, of families who ate together in dim cottages, of trenchers that doubled as plates, of spoons worn smooth by generations of hands. Yet in these objects, we see the quiet history of humanity. We see how scarcity shaped manners, how religion shaped diets, how trade introduced change. We see how ordinary lives left traces not in chronicles of kings, but in the worn edges of a spoon or the dull shine of a pewter plate. The table of the commoner was not extravagant, but it was essential. Around it, people prayed, ate, learned patience, and shared hardship. It was the silent heart of medieval survival. So ends the story of pewter plates and wooden spoons. It is a story of objects humble and unremarkable, yet central to life. The commoner's table carried not feasts of kings, but the daily bread of survival. And in that bread, in those spoons, in those trenchers, we glimpse the history of ordinary existence. Today, when you lay a table with plates, forks, and glasses, it may seem mundane, but behind each object lies a lineage stretching back centuries, to wooden spoons smoothed by callous hands, to pewter plates that bore bread and cheese, to trenchers that blurred food and utensil. The modern meal rests on the quiet labor of countless forgotten tables. When you think of the Middle Ages, you might imagine knights on horseback, peasants in fields, or castles looming above villages. But another figure deserves your attention. The monk bent over a desk, quill in hand, scratching letters onto parchment by candlelight. His work was not glamorous, not heroic, not celebrated in battle songs. And yet, without him, much of what we know of the medieval world would have been lost. The scribe was a quiet laborer in words, a keeper of knowledge, a transmitter of culture. He lived not on the battlefield or in the marketplace, but in the stillness of cloisters and scriptoria. His tools were ink, feather, and patience. His world was one of silence, repetition, and devotion. In monasteries across medieval Europe, scriptoria, the writing rooms, became the workshops of scribes. These rooms were often cold, dimly lit, and austere. Monks sat at wooden desks, copying text line by line. Some worked alone, others in groups, but the atmosphere was always one of discipline and silence. The purpose was not creativity, but preservation. Ancient texts, religious manuscripts, and legal documents were all copied by hand. Every page required hours of concentration, every letter a careful act of labor. Imagine entering such a room. The scratching of quills fills the air, punctuated by the occasional cough. Candles sputter, casting shadows on pages. The smell of ink and parchment mixes with the mustiness of stone walls. It is monotonous, but also purposeful, the quiet heartbeat of literate culture. The scribe's tools were few, but each mattered deeply. Quills, carved from goose feathers, trimmed to a fine nib and regularly resharpened with small knives. The quill was both fragile and flexible, demanding constant attention. Ink, made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic. Ink was mixed carefully to produce deep black writing that would endure. Red ink, from cinnabar or other minerals, was used for headings and decorations. Parchment, animal skins stretched and scraped, provided the surface. Smooth yet tough, parchment carried words across centuries. For less important texts, rougher vellum, or even wax tablets might be used. Rulers and styluses. Lines were ruled onto pages to guide writing. Without them, text would slant or drift. These tools transformed thought into permanence. The monk's world revolved around them, each object an extension of his devotion. The life of a scribe was one of endurance. Hours were spent hunched over desks, eyes straining in dim light. Hands cramped, backs ached, yet the work continued. In winter, scriptoria were freezing. In summer, stifling. Scribes often complained in the margins of manuscripts. Notes survived where monks wrote their weariness. "Oh, my hand," or "this page was written in the cold," or even humorous lines like, "Now I've finished, give me a drink." These marginal notes reveal the humanity behind the discipline. The scribe was not a faceless machine, but a man enduring long, tedious labor. The content varied. Religious texts dominated. Bibles, psalters, commentaries, sermons. These were central to monastic life. But scribes also copied classical works, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, preserving ancient learning for future generations. Legal texts, charters, and chronicles also filled their desks. In monasteries, scribes recorded land grants and agreements, securing the wealth and rights of their institutions. Chroniclers, often monks themselves, wrote annals of events, blending fact with interpretation. Thus, the scribe shaped both memory and authority. His words preserved theology, philosophy, law, and history. Without him, much of medieval culture, and even classical antiquity, would have vanished. The act of writing was considered a form of devotion. Copying Holy Scripture was not mere labor, but prayer. Each word was a meditation, each page an offering to God. The discipline of silence in the scriptorium was both practical and spiritual. This does not mean all scribes were saints. Some scribbled jokes or drawings in margins. Cats sometimes wander across wet ink, leaving paw prints that still survive in manuscripts today. Yet beneath the monotony, the work carried a profound sense of purpose. To preserve the Word of God, to sustain learning, to hold memory against time. The monk scribe lived in a world of ink and silence. His tools were simple, his labor repetitive, his life obscure. And yet, through his hands flowed the survival of knowledge. His goose-feather quill, dipped into dark ink, connected past the future, ancient text of modern reader. But this is only the beginning. For beyond the scriptorium lies a larger story. How scribes influenced power, how their errors and choices shaped texts, and how the work of copying became the foundation for medieval learning itself. The monk scribe of the Middle Ages was more than a silent copyist. His work carried immense weight. Each letter he wrote shaped how future generations would understand the past, the church, and even the authority of kings. In the quiet of the scriptorium, decisions were made, sometimes consciously, sometimes through error, that influenced law, theology, and culture for centuries. Despite discipline, scribes were human. Copying was monotonous, and errors crept into manuscripts. A skipped line, a repeated phrase, or a mistaken word could alter meaning. Sometimes these mistakes were corrected in the margins. Other times they became part of the text itself. In some cases, these errors shaped theology. A miscopied passage might reinforce a certain interpretation of Scripture. Over centuries, Such variations accumulated, creating subtle but significant differences between texts. Scribes knew this risk. Guides circulated, reminding them to check their work carefully. Yet fatigue, poor light, and human fallibility made perfection impossible. Behind the authority of sacred words lay the fragile labor of weary men. Not all scribes wrote only in plain black ink. Some worked with illuminators, artists who decorated manuscripts with gold leaf, brilliant colors, and intricate designs. These illuminated manuscripts transformed books into treasures, blending art with devotion. Borders bloomed with vines, flowers, and strange creatures. Initial letters swelled into elaborate shapes. Gold leaf caught the candlelight, making the page glow as if touched by heaven itself. While not every monastery could afford such embellishment, the most important texts, Bibles, Psalters, and Gospels, were often richly illuminated. They served not only as tools of devotion, but as symbols of wealth and prestige. A monastery with illuminated manuscripts displayed both piety and prosperity. Scribes also shaped politics. Charters, land grants, and legal documents passed through their hands. A scribe's careful Latin determined who owned fields, mills, and forests. Kings and lords relied on scribes to record their authority. The permanence of writing gave power stability. Spoken words could be denied or forgotten, but a written charter sealed with wax endured. Disputes over land, rights, and privileges often came down to documents preserved in monasteries, written by anonymous monks decades earlier. Thus, the quiet work of scribes underpinned the structures of power. Behind every grant of land or privilege lay the steady hand of a man bent over parchment, quill scratching, ink drying into permanence. Language itself reinforced authority. Latin was a language of church and state. Ordinary villagers, speaking local dialects, could not read it. Scribes, trained in Latin, mediated between the written and the spoken, between power and the people. This gave scribes immense influence. They controlled not only what was written, but also who could access it. A misinterpretation, whether intentional or accidental, could shift meaning in ways most villagers would never know. The monopoly of Latin made the written word both sacred and distant. It was a tool of authority, wielded quietly in ink and parchment. Beyond errors in politics, scribes carried the responsibility of preserving knowledge. Ancient texts survived only because monks copied them. Works of Aristotle, Virgil, and Cicero were rescued from oblivion in scriptoria. Without scribes, the classical tradition might have been lost entirely. This act of preservation was not always intentional. Monks copied texts because they valued them or because they needed parchment filled. Yet the result was profound. The ancient world lived on through their hands. Every page copied was a bridge across centuries, connecting past and future. The survival of civilization's memory depended on men who never sought fame, who labored in silence. While the main text was serious, margins often revealed the humanity of scribes. Notes complain of cold, hunger, and fatigue. Others slip in humor or personal remarks. I am very tired, or let the reader not blame the scribe if this text is flawed. Some added drawings, faces, animals, even jokes tucked beside solemn scripture. Cats' left paw prints. Children doodled, monks sketched while bored. These glimpses remind us that scribes, though devoted, were still human, living lives of tedium, humor, and quiet rebellion within their work. The scribe's work was never neutral. His errors shaped theology. His artistry illuminated devotion. His documents underpinned kingdoms. His Latin reinforced authority. His copying preserved civilization itself. In the margins of medieval manuscripts, we glimpse both the fragility and the power of writing. Behind every sacred word stood human hands, steady yet fallible, laboring in silence. But the story does not end here. For beyond the quiet labor lies a long legacy. How scribes laid the foundation for literacy, how their work gave way to printing, and how their goose feathers shaped the modern world of books. For centuries, the scribe's quill ruled the written word. Every charter, every psalter, every poem passed through his hand. The goose feather scratched across parchment, shaping the memory of civilizations. But no profession lasts forever. In the 15th century, a machine appeared that would transform the world: the printing press. The quiet, cloistered labor of the monk scribe gave way to the clatter of movable type, and with it, a revolution in knowledge. Johannes Gutenberg's press, developed around 1450 in Mainz, changed everything. By arranging small metal letters that could be reused, printers produced books far more quickly than scribes ever could. A single press could print hundreds of pages in the time it took a scribe to copy a few. The shift was staggering. Books, once rare and expensive, multiplied. What had once required months of labor now took days. The monopoly of monasteries and universities on knowledge began to dissolve. Ordinary people, not just monks and nobles, could access books. For scribes, this was the beginning of the end. Their painstaking craft, once the lifeline of culture, was suddenly obsolete. Not all welcomed the press. Some monks distrusted printed books, claiming they lacked the beauty and sacred aura of handwritten manuscripts. Illuminated texts with gold leaf and intricate design still carried prestige, and for a time, scribes continued to produce them for wealthy patrons. But the tide was unstoppable. Even illuminated manuscripts gave way to printed books with woodcut illustrations. By the late 15th century, the balance had shifted. Scribes survived only in niche roles, their broad profession fading into memory. One irony of the transition is that scribal errors, so common in manuscripts, gave way to new kinds of mistakes. Printing eliminated many copying slips, but when errors occurred, they spread quickly through entire print runs. A misprinted Bible might contain thousands of flawed copies, whereas a miscopied manuscript affected only one. Yet overall, printing stabilized texts. The Bible, classical works, and legal codes could now be reproduced with consistent accuracy. The work of countless scribes, spread unevenly across centuries, was crystallized into standard editions. Perhaps the greatest change was access. Monks had once copied texts primarily from monasteries and universities. With printing, books spread to merchants, artisans, and eventually peasants. Literacy slowly expanded. The monopoly of Latin weakened as texts appeared in vernacular languages. The Protestant Reformation would ride this wave, spreading pamphlets and vernacular Bibles. New ideas moved quickly, no longer confined to slow scribal reproduction. The printing press, born in Europe, unleashed revolutions of thought across the world. By the 16th century, the monk bent over his quill was no longer central to society. Some scriptoria lingered, producing ceremonial manuscripts, but most faded. The silence of scribes' desks gave way to the noise of presses and workshops. Yet the scribe's legacy endured. Without centuries of copying, the works of antiquity would not have survived for the printer to reproduce. Without the labor of anonymous monks, there would have been little for Gutenberg's press to multiply. The press was revolutionary, but it stood on the shoulders of scribes. It is tempting to see scribes as mere copyists, their work replaced by machines. But that would be unjust. For 1,000 years, they were the guardians of memory. Their ink preserved scripture, philosophy, law, and poetry. Their quills carried voices across centuries, ensuring that civilization spoke to one another across time. Each manuscript bears the imprint of their patience. The smooth strokes of letters, the occasional slip, the marginal notes of fatigue. In their silence, they laid the foundation of literacy, preparing the world for the explosion of print. The story of scribes ends not with glory but with quiet disappearance. From cloisters and scriptoria, they watched as presses rose and their craft faded. Yet their role in history is profound. They were the unseen hands that bridged antiquity and modernity, carrying fragile knowledge across centuries of war, famine, and forgetfulness. So, the next time you open a printed book, consider the lineage it carries. Behind its uniform letters lies a memory of monks who bent over parchment, dipping goose feathers into ink, straining their eyes by candlelight, laboring not for fame but for preservation. Their ink has long dried. Their names are mostly forgotten, but their work endures in every page you read. When you imagine a medieval village at night, you may think of silence under the stars, the flicker of firelight, or the toll of a church bell fading into darkness. But inside cottages, the scene was less romantic. Smoky air, cramped rooms, scratchy bedding, and the constant irritation of insects. Sleep, that most ordinary of human needs, was shaped by the realities of poverty, architecture, and survival. For the medieval peasant, rest was not about comfort, but endurance. Thatched roofs leaked, fleas bit, and beds were shared by families, servants, and sometimes even animals. The story of medieval sleep is not one of sweet dreams, but survival through long, uncomfortable nights. The typical peasant's home was small, 1 or 2 rooms at most. Walls were built of wattle and daub, a lattice of wooden strips coated with clay and straw. The floor was packed earth, swept but never smooth. In the center, a hearth burned, its smoke drifting upward, sometimes escaping through a hole in the roof, sometimes lingering in the room. Above, the roof was thatched with straw or reeds. Thatched roofs were practical and cheap, but they attracted pests. Birds nested in them, mice burrowed through them, and insects thrived in their damp layers. To sleep beneath such a roof was to share your nights with creatures that stirred overhead. Beds, when they existed, were simple frames of wood with ropes or slats stretched across. Upon this base, straw was piled, covered by coarse linen or woolen blankets. Wealthier peasants might have feather mattresses, but most slept on straw pallets. Straw bedding had to be replaced frequently, for it grew dirty and damp, harboring vermin. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in it, biting sleepers through the night. Some households spread herbs like lavender or wormwood to repel pests, but relief was temporary. The phrase "sleep tight" may trace to the tightening of ropes on such beds, adjusted to keep the straw mattress firm. But no matter how tightly pulled, comfort was relative. Privacy was rare. Families often slept together in one room. Parents, children, and sometimes servants shared beds or lay side by side on pallets. In poorer homes, everyone crowded near the hearth, where warmth was most reliable. Animals, too, often slept indoors. Chickens might roost in corners. Pigs or goats might share space during harsh winters. Their presence added warmth, but also noise and odor. Sleep was communal, not solitary. This sharing extended beyond family. Travelers, lodgers, and laborers might also share beds when space was scarce. The modern notion of personal sleeping space was foreign to medieval life. Sleep itself followed a different rhythm than today. Without artificial light, nights were long, especially in winter. Many scholars believe medieval people practiced segmented sleep. They slept for several hours, woke in the middle of the night, then returned to rest until dawn. During this waking period, people prayed, tended fires, checked on animals, or even visited neighbors. It was a quiet interlude, a time for reflection or necessary chores. Sleep was not one unbroken stretch, but a cycle tied to natural rhythms. Medieval villages were not silent. Dogs barked, roosters crowed, and church bells marked hours. In towns, carts rattled, watchmen called, and drunks stumbled through streets. Even in villages, the night was filled with the sounds of animals, wind, and neighbors. Darkness, however, was profound. Candles and rushlights were expensive, so most families relied on the fire's glow. Once it dimmed, the cottage sank into shadows. To step outside was to enter near total darkness, broken only by stars or moonlight. To sleep in a medieval village was to surrender not to comfort, but to necessity. You lay on straw, scratched by fleas, crowded by family, warmed by animals, lulled by firelight and disturbed by noise. It was not luxury, but survival. Yet in this rough setting, people found rest enough to labor another day. Sleep, imperfect though it was, sustained the endless rhythm of work and prayer that defined their lives. But this is only the beginning. For beyond the daily reality of straw and fleas lies a deeper story. How ideas of sleep connected to medicine, morality, and community, and how the very act of resting became a reflection of medieval life itself. The physical setting of medieval sleep, straw beds, smoky cottages, noisy animals, was only part of the story. Sleep was not merely a bodily function, but a matter of health, morality, and even spirituality. Medieval thinkers, physicians, and priests all had opinions on when, how, and how much one ought to rest. To sleep was never only to close one's eyes. It was to navigate a world of medical theories, religious warnings, and cultural fears about the night. Medieval medicine revolved around the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was thought to depend on keeping these fluids in balance. Sleep, like eating or bleeding, was part of the system. Physicians taught that too much sleep produced excess phlegm, making a person sluggish and dull. Too little sleep, by contrast, overheated the body and disturbed the humors. Moderation was advised. 6 to 8 hours of rest was considered ideal. The timing of sleep mattered. 2. Sleeping immediately after eating was discouraged, as it was thought to trap vapors in the stomach and cause illness. Instead, one should walk or pray before lying down. Even the direction of one's bed could matter. Some guides suggested lying with the head to the east, aligned with the rising sun, for better health. For peasants, such theories were distant, but the influence of medical thought trickled down. Advice on rest was repeated in sermons, in household manuals, and in folk traditions. Sleep was framed not only as bodily necessity, but as a medical act. The church added another dimension. Sleep was acceptable, but too much sleep became sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins. Preachers warned against oversleeping, linking it to laziness, vice, and neglect of prayer. To rise early was praised as virtuous. To linger in bed was condemned as indulgence. Monastic rules reinforced this ethic. Monks rose in the middle of the night for matins, the night prayer, disrupting their sleep to serve God. Their example filtered into broader culture, shaping expectations that even lay people should resist excessive rest. Thus, sleep carried a moral weight. To rest enough was natural. To rest too much was sinful. Even in a world where fatigue was constant, guilt could intrude on the bed of straw. Beyond morality and medicine, the medieval night carried its own risks. Darkness was associated with uncertainty, danger, and the devil. To step outside after sundown was to risk thieves, wolves, or wandering spirits. For this reason, many preferred to remain indoors once the fire dimmed. Doors were barred, shutters closed, prayers said. Night was not only a time for sleep, but for vigilance against forces, both natural and supernatural, that lurked in the dark. Children were warned of spirits that haunted the night. Folk tales of demons and witches often centered on darkness, reinforcing fear of what lay beyond the hearth. The night's silence was never fully trusted. As noted earlier, many medieval people practiced segmented sleep, 2 periods of rest separated by an hour or more wakefulness. This pattern, recorded in diaries, medical texts, and legal documents, was accepted as normal. The waking period, often around midnight, was used for prayer, reflection, or quiet tasks. Couples sometimes used this time for intimacy. Farmers might tend fires or animals. Some even visited neighbors, suggesting that the village at night was not entirely still. This segmented rhythm aligned with the longer nights of winter and the absence of artificial light. It reflected adaptation to the environment rather than a disruption of normal sleep. To medieval people, it was simply the way of things. Dreams, too, carried meaning. Medieval thinkers, drawing on both classical and biblical traditions, believed dreams could reveal truths, warnings, or even divine messages. Joseph's dreams in the Bible were remembered as signs from God. But dreams could also be traps of the devil, leading the sleeper into temptation or false visions. Guides on dream interpretation circulated, mixing folklore with theology. A dream of fire might signal passion, a dream of water, illness, a dream of flight, danger. For the commoner, dreams were often recounted in the morning as signs or omens. Even on a straw mattress beneath a thatched roof, the sleeping mind was thought to connect to worlds beyond the visible. To sleep in the Middle Ages was to enter not only rest, but a moral, medical, and spiritual landscape. Physicians warned of humors. Priests warned of sloth. Neighbors whispered of spirits. The night was both necessary and dangerous, both a gift and a temptation. And yet, people adapted. They woke in the middle of the night to tend fires or whisper prayers. They endured fleas and straw. They dreamed and sought meaning in those dreams. Sleep, like every part of medieval life, was woven into a fabric of faith, fear, and necessity. But the story is not yet complete. For in the final section, we must look closer at the broader cultural role of sleep. How rest was tied to community, how beds became symbols of inheritance, and how even the act of lying down carried significance in the rhythm of medieval life. The medieval night was never only about rest. It was about sharing space, enduring discomfort, and finding community in the darkness. To lie down on straw beneath a thatched roof was to participate in a world where beds were not just furniture but precious family possessions, where sleep was communal, and where the rhythms of the night shaped both identity and memory. For the modern reader, a bed may seem ordinary, but in the Middle Ages, a bed was one of the most valuable objects in a household. In wills and inventories, beds were listed alongside livestock, tools, and land. They were inherited, passed from parents to children, and treated as markers of wealth. A well-built bed frame, with ropes and a proper mattress of wool or feathers, was a sign of status. Peasants might make do with pallets of straw on the ground, but even these had value. To own bedding at all was a form of security. The language of inheritance reflects this. A son might be granted the best bed, as part of share, while servants or distant kin received lesser pallets. Beds carried not just bodies but memory, linking generations through the act of sleep. The most striking feature of medieval sleep was its communal nature. Families crowded into the same bed, children tucked between parents, servants lying nearby, travelers welcome at the edge of straw mattresses. This intimacy carried both comfort and difficulty. Warmth was shared, but so were pests, snores, and restless movements. Privacy, as we understand it, was nearly absent, yet this closeness reinforced bonds. A child fell asleep to the sound of parents' breathing. A servant shared in the rhythms of the household. Sleep was not isolation, but participation in community. Even lords and nobles, though more richly furnished, shared beds. Visitors, friends, and allies often slept together, the act of sharing a bed symbolizing trust and camaraderie. What today might seem strange was in a gesture of fellowship. Though the night was dangerous, it was also social. In towns, inns and taverns offered shared sleeping arrangements. Travelers, often strangers, might sleep side by side. In villages, midnight waking periods sometimes led to whispered conversations, shared prayers, or quiet labor done together. The night bound people together as much as the day. To endure cold, noise, and fleas was to share a common fate. In this way, sleep reinforced community just as meals and labor did. Beds also reflected identity. The poor, sleeping on straw in smoky cottages, lived a different night than the wealthy in curtained beds draped with linens. The contrast between the noble's feather mattress and the peasant's pallet of straw was a stark marker of status. Yet even among peasants, distinctions existed. A family with a well-made bed frame stood above neighbors who slept on bare ground. Bedding materials, wool, linen, straw, spoke of wealth and survival. To lie down each night was not just a rest, but to occupy one's place in the social order, visible in the very structure of the bed. The bed carried symbolic weight beyond life. To die in one's bed was considered a good death. The deathbed became a metaphor for final moments, a place where family gathered, prayers were spoken, and last words recorded. Beds thus bridged daily life and eternity. They were where one rested each night, and where one prepared to rest forever. The same wooden frame that carried childhood sleep might also carry the body into death, surrounded by family and faith. Despite fleas, drafts, and smoke, medieval people found ways to endure the night. Herbs were scattered in bedding to deter insects. Blankets were layered for warmth. Curtains, when affordable, provided privacy and trapped heat. Prayers framed sleep, asking for protection through the darkness. The hardships of sleep were accepted as part of life, no more avoidable than hunger or toil. Complaints appeared in marginal notes and stories, but so too did humor and resilience. People laughed about bed bugs, teased each other about snoring, and told tales of restless nights. In this way, the medieval night, however uncomfortable, became part of the fabric of life, shared, endured, and remembered. So ends a story of thatched roofs and fleas. To sleep in a medieval village was to share space, endure pests, and rest in the company of family, servants, and animals. Beds were not private sanctuaries, but communal possessions treasured across generations. The night was both feared and embraced, a time of darkness filled with danger, but also a time of closeness and continuity. The straw pallet, the wooden frame, the goose feather mattress, all bore the weight of history, memory, and identity. When you close your eyes tonight in a modern bed, Spare a thought for those who slept centuries ago beneath smoky rafters, scratching at fleas, praying for dawn, and finding in sleep not comfort but survival. Imagine a medieval village after sunset. The church bell has tolled the hour. Fields lie in silence, and smoke drifts slowly from cottage chimneys. But inside homes, the struggle against darkness begins. Without electricity, without gas lamps, the medieval household relied on fragile tools. Candles of tallow or beeswax, rushlights made from reeds, and the fading glow of the hearth. Artificial light was precious. It determined how long people could work, read, or socialize after sundown. It shaped rhythms of life, from prayers to bedtime stories, from scribes in monasteries to peasants in cottages. The flicker of a candle or rushlight may seem small, but it defined the boundary between day and night for centuries. Before anything else, there was a hearth. In cottages and halls alike, the fire was the main source of light after sunset. Flames provided both heat and illumination. Families gathered around it to eat, talk, or finish simple tasks. But firelight was uneven, smoky, and limited. Shadows loomed in corners. Details were hard to see, and once the fire burned low, the room slipped into darkness. Fire was essential, but it was not enough for finer tasks like reading, writing, or delicate craftwork. For ordinary peasants, the cheapest source of light beyond the fire was a rushlight. A rushlight was made from the stalk of the rush plant, peeled and dried, then soaked in animal fat or grease. It burned quickly, often unevenly, producing smoke and a dim flame. Rushlights were held in simple iron holders, their thin stems glowing weakly in the dark. They could not be relied upon for long. They sputtered out quickly, sometimes within an hour, but they were cheap, easy to make, and widely available. The rushlight was a poor man's candle, humble, smoky, and fleeting. More reliable were tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat. They were thicker, burned longer, and could be molded in quantity, but they too had drawbacks. Tallow candles smoked heavily, smelled unpleasant, and dripped greasy residue. Still, for most families, tallow candles were the main source of light. They were used sparingly, often saved for tasks that demanded better illumination. A peasant might light a candle to work on tools, mend clothing, or tend to a sick child. To leave one burning idly was wasteful, even unthinkable. At the top of the hierarchy stood beeswax candles. Clean, long-lasting, and sweet-smelling, they burned with a steady flame. But beeswax was expensive, controlled largely by monasteries and churches. In churches and cathedrals, beeswax candles lit altars and services, their steady flames seen as fitting offerings to God. Nobles, too, used beeswax in their halls, illuminating feasts and gatherings with a light both practical and symbolic of wealth. For commoners, however, beeswax was almost unattainable. A single candle could cost more than a day's wage. Thus, beeswax became not just a tool of light, but a marker of privilege. Because light was scarce, medieval life adapted to its absence. Most people rose with the sun and ended their labor soon after sunset. Night was for sleep, punctuated by brief tasks done by firelight or rushlight. Only the wealthy, monasteries, or towns with larger resources could extend activity deep into the night. Monks copied text by candlelight. Nobles dined under chandeliers of beeswax, and towns sometimes used torches to light streets. But for the majority, darkness set the limit. Light defined class as much as it defined time. To sit by beeswax was to belong to privilege. To huddle by a rushlight was to belong to poverty. The story of medieval light begins with these fragile flames. Rushlights sputtering in cottages, tallow candles smoking in modest homes, beeswax candles glowing in churches. Each flame marked a fragile victory of humanity against the night. But this was only the beginning, for beyond the humble rushlight lay deeper stories of how light was rationed, how it shaped work and worship, and how its symbolism touched every corner of medieval life. The medieval world's relationship with artificial light was shaped not just by technology, but by scarcity. Light was costly, fragile, and limited. To burn a candle or rushlight was to make a decision. What task was important enough? What prayer urgent enough? What gathering worthy enough to justify consuming precious wax or fat? In this way, light became both an economic commodity and a symbol of status, devotion, and order. Unlike today, where a flick of a switch banishes the dark, in the Middle Ages, every flame carried weight. Candles were measured by how long they would burn. A tallow candle might last 2 or 3 hours. A beeswax candle, longer. Households rationed them carefully. A single candle might be lit only during supper, then extinguished immediately. A rushlight might be saved for a single chore, mending a garment, checking a sick child, or finishing work delayed by rain. To waste light was to waste food, for candles drew on the same resources, fat, wax, oil, that also sustained the body. Thus, the medieval night was not only darker than ours, but also punctuated by careful decisions. Do we need this flame now? The kind of light a household used reflected its status. The poor relied on rushlights, smoky and dim. Townsfolk and modest farmers managed tallow candles, greasy but steady. Nobles and clergy enjoyed beeswax, clean and golden. The difference was more than practical. It was symbolic. To dine by beeswax was to mark oneself as wealthy, refined, close to God. To huddle by a rushlight was to belong to the masses. The very glow of a flame signaled who you were. Monasteries, with their control over bees and wax, reinforced this divide. Beeswax candles lit altars not simply because they burned cleanly, but because they were considered pure, appropriate for holy spaces. Ordinary villagers, by contrast, prayed in the dim light of tallow or fire. In churches, candles took on a sacred role. Parishioners donated candles as offerings, each flame representing a prayer, a soul remembered, or a plea for intercession. To light a candle before a saint's image was to make devotion visible. Festivals and holy days filled churches with light. Rows of beeswax candles burned in celebration, their glow transforming cold stone into radiant space. In such moments, light was not merely practical. It was spiritual, a symbol of divine presence. This symbolism extended beyond churches. In homes, a candle might be lit during childbirth, death, or illness, serving as both illumination and protection. To keep a flame alive was to ward off danger, both physical and spiritual. For most peasants, labor ended at sunset, but in monasteries and among artisans, candlelight extended the day. Scribes copied texts by flickering flame, their quills scratching into the night. Tailors and spinners sometimes worked longer, aided by candles when deadlines loomed. Yet candlelight was imperfect. Smoke stung eyes, flames guttered, shadows shifted. Prolonged work by such light strained the body. Still, for those whose livelihoods required it, the candle became a tool of trade, stretching hours and squeezing more from the day. Towns also found uses for light in public spaces. Torches illuminated festivals, markets, or processions. On special occasions, entire streets might glow with candles placed in windows. Such displays turned light into a communal celebration, marking weddings, coronations, or religious feasts. But regular street lighting was rare. Most towns remained dark and dangerous after nightfall. Light was reserved for moments of significance, not daily convenience. In medieval thought, light carried profound meaning. It symbolized God, truth, and goodness. Darkness, by contrast, suggested sin, ignorance, and danger. To step into the dark was to enter uncertainty, both physical and moral. Candles, then, were not only practical tools, but moral symbols. A flame was purity. A candle lit in prayer was devotion embodied. The struggle to preserve light against the night echoed humanity's larger struggle against sin and chaos. Even in humble cottages, this symbolism was felt. To light a rushlight at night was to push back against the unknown, to carve out a small circle of safety in a world where wolves, thieves, and spirits lurked in the dark. The economy of light reveals a world where every flame mattered. A candle was food transformed into illumination, a luxury measured in hours, a symbol of both status and spirituality. From smoky rushlights in cottages to golden beeswax in cathedrals, light marked the boundary between poverty and wealth, earth and heaven, survival and devotion. But the story of medieval light is not finished. For in the final part, we must explore how light shaped daily rhythms, how it governed sleep, labor, and festivity, and how the long struggle against darkness reveals the essence of medieval life. The medieval world was defined by shadows. Daylight guided labor. Nightfall ended it. Artificial light was scarce, costly, and fragile. And so, the way people lived, when they worked, when they prayed, when they gathered, was bound to the flicker of flames. To trace the history of medieval light is to uncover the rhythms of time itself. For peasants, light dictated labor. Fields were worked from sunrise to sunset. In summer, days stretched long, filled with ceaseless toil. In winter, the shortness of light curtailed labor, forcing families indoors to spin wool, mend tools, or tend animals. Candles could extend the day, but few could afford to burn them for routine work. A farmer did not light candles to thresh grain or mend harnesses. Such tasks were left for daylight. Only the wealthy, the clergy, and certain artisans could justify the cost of working into the night. Thus, the poor lived close to nature's clock, their lives framed by dawn and dusk, their time measured by the rising and setting sun. Candles themselves sometimes served as crude timekeepers. A candle marked with notches would burn down at a steady rate, indicating the passage of hours. Monks, in particular, used such candles to regulate prayers. The bell tower and the candle worked in tandem. The bell announced the hour, while the flame revealed its length. Time in the Middle Ages was not yet mechanical. It was organic, tied to the flow of wax and the fall of shadows. Monastic life was perhaps the most illuminated of medieval existence. Monks rose in the night from matins, their prayers lit by candles. Scriptoria glowed with steady flames as scribes copied texts deep into the evening. In churches, beeswax candles shone upon altars, symbolizing both faith and divine order. The glow of light in monasteries contrasted with the darkness of peasant cottages. Where the villager rationed a single rushlight, the monk's world was filled with beeswax, steady and golden. In this way, light reflected not only devotion but institutional wealth. If ordinary nights were dim, festivals were radiant. Religious feasts often transformed towns into glowing spectacles. Candles lined altars, processions carried torches, windows blazed with light. On Candlemas, February 2nd, churches blessed candles for the coming year. Entire congregations held lit tapers, their flames symbolizing Christ as the light of the world. On such days, even the poorest might hold beeswax, if only for a moment, and feel the glow of sacred radiance. In some towns, civic celebrations also relied on light. Royal entries, weddings, or victories might be marked by torchlit parades. The rare brilliance of night, filled with flame, became a communal memory, contrasting with the usual darkness. For all its symbolism, light was always fragile. A gust of wind could snuff a rushlight. A dropped candle could ignite a cottage. Darkness returned quickly, bringing with it uncertainty and fear. Medieval people spoke of demons, witches, and spirits prowling the night. Whether believed literally or symbolically, these fears reinforced caution. To keep a flame alive was to guard against more than physical darkness. It was to hold back chaos. The fragility of flame mirrored the fragility of life. Both could end suddenly. Both required vigilance. Both reminded people of their dependence on forces beyond their control. Over centuries, light technology advanced only slowly. Oil lamps, common in the Mediterranean, supplemented candles, but they too required costly resources. Street lighting, even in towns, remained rare until the early modern era. For most of the Middle Ages, the struggle against darkness remained largely unchanged. What did change was meaning. As trade expanded, candles became commodities. As monasteries grew wealthy, light became more closely tied to prestige. And as towns expanded, the contrast between illuminated spaces and rural dark deepened. But at its heart, the rhythm remained the same. Day belonged to the sun, night to the fragile flicker of human fire. Picture a medieval family at night. A single candle burns on the table, its wax dripping, its flame wavering. Around it, children huddle, parents mend clothes, and a pot simmers faintly by the hearth. Outside, the village lies in silence, swallowed by shadows. This tiny circle of light defines the world. Beyond it is uncertainty, danger, and mystery. Within it is warmth, community, and survival. The candle is not just an object. It is a boundary between order and chaos, between safety and fear, between the known and the unknown. So ends the story of candles and rushlights. From smoky rushes in peasant cottages to golden beeswax in cathedrals, the medieval struggle against darkness reveals the core of daily life. Light was economy, symbol, and rhythm. It measured time, shaped community, and embodied faith. Today, light is effortless, flooding rooms at the touch of a switch. But once it was hard-won, rationed carefully, and revered as sacred. Each flame mattered. Each hour of burning carried weight. The modern world rests on a foundation of forgotten shadows, built by centuries of people who live within the fragile glow of rushlights and candles. Today, time is everywhere. Watches glow on our wrists. Phones tick with precision. Clocks hum silently on walls. But in the Middle Ages, time was not measured by seconds and minutes. It was felt in the rhythm of bells, the turning of the sun, the length of shadows. For most people, time was not an exact figure, but an audible call. The toll of a church bell drifting across fields and villages. Before mechanical clocks spread widely, bells told people when to wake, when to pray, when to work, and when to rest. To live in a medieval village was to live by sound, not by the sweep of hands across a dial. At the center of every village stood a church, and above it, a tower. From that tower hung the bell, sometimes small, sometimes massive, but always central. Its ringing carried across the fields, cutting through wind, rain, and daily noise. The bell marked the canonical hours, matins in the night, lauds at dawn, prime in the early morning, terce mid-morning, sex at midday, none in the afternoon, vespers in the evening, and compline at night. These rhythms structure the lives of monks, but they also shape villagers' days. Even if peasants did not attend every service, the sound of the bell divided time into intervals larger than minutes, but smaller than days. The bell was the heartbeat of the village, a sound as constant as the crowing of roosters or the setting of the sun. For peasants, work was measured not by hours, but by tasks. The ringing of the bell for sex might remind them to pause for a meal. Vespers might signal the end of labor. Time was seasonal, tied to harvest, daylight, and weather. Imagine bending in a field of wheat. The sun climbs, sweat drips, and suddenly the sound of a bell drifts across the fields. It is terce, the third hour of the day. You pause, stretch your back, perhaps say a short prayer. Time is not measured by a device, but by sound and body. In this way, bells link the abstract order of the church to the physical labor of the fields. In towns, bells played an even broader role. Towers marked not only religious hours, but civic life. Bells rang to announce markets, curfews, and emergencies. The alarm bell could summon townsfolk to defend walls, fight fires, or attend assemblies. Each town's bell had its own voice, a tone villagers recognized instantly. The ringing of one bell might mean prayer, another might mean danger. In larger towns, bell towers multiplied, layering the soundscape with signals that ordered both sacred and secular life. Bells also marked life's milestones. They tolled for weddings, baptisms, and funerals. The slow, heavy ringing of a funeral bell spread solemnity across a community, reminding all of mortality. The joyful pealing of wedding bells carried happiness into every street. To live in a medieval town or village was to have one's life echoed in bells, born to their ringing, wed to their peal, buried to their toll. Before mechanical clocks, bells were the voice of time. They divided days into prayers, work, meals, and rest. They marked life's passages, sounded alarms, and unified communities through shared sound. But this is only the beginning, for beyond the toll of bells lay deeper systems. Water clocks, sundials, and eventually the rise of mechanical timekeeping that began to challenge the authority of bells. If bells were the sound of time in the Middle Ages, they were not its only measure. Before mechanical clocks became common, people relied on simpler tools. The shadow of a stick, the drip of water, the burning of a candle. These methods were imprecise, fragile, and inconsistent, but they revealed how medieval people understood time. Not as precise minutes and seconds, but as a flexible rhythm shaped by nature and necessity. The oldest tool for telling time was a sundial. A stick or gnomon cast a shadow whose length and position revealed the hour. In monasteries and towns, sundials were mounted on walls, marking the passage of sunlight through the day. But sundials had limits. They worked only when the sun shone, leaving cloudy days and long winter nights unmeasured. Their accuracy was rough, suited more for broad divisions of the day than for punctual schedules. Still, sundials mattered. They connected time to the natural world, reminding people that hours were bound to the turning of the earth and the light of the sun. To watch a shadow move was to watch time itself sliding across the ground. Other devices tried to measure time in darkness. Water clocks, clepsydras, used the steady drip of water from one vessel to another. They had been used since antiquity and survived into the medieval world, especially in monasteries where prayers had to be marked at night. Candle clocks offered another method. A candle marked with notches burned steadily downward, each notch representing a passage of time. Monks could wake for matins by watching the candle's progress. These clocks, though crude, gave structure to hours when bells alone were insufficient. But like sundials, these methods were fragile. A draft of wind could change a candle's burn. A frozen pipe could stop a water clock. Time remained uncertain, more approximation than precision. It was in monasteries that the demand for accurate timekeeping grew strongest. The rule of St. Benedict required prayers at specific hours, day and night. To maintain this rhythm, monks needed reliable signals. At first, bells sufficed, rung according to natural cues. But over time, the need for greater consistency drove innovation. Devices like water clocks were maintained carefully. Some monasteries employed timekeepers whose duty was to ensure that bells rang at the right hours, preserving the discipline of prayer. Thus, religious devotion became one of the earliest engines pushing Europe toward more precise time. By the late 13th century, mechanical clocks began to appear in Europe. Their origins are debated, but England, France, and Italy all claim early examples. These clocks use weights and gears to regulate movement, producing regular chimes. The first mechanical clocks were massive, installed in cathedral towers and civic halls. They did not have faces or hands, but struck bells at regular intervals. Their purpose was not to show time privately, but to announce it publicly, uniting communities under a shared rhythm. The sound of these early clocks transformed life. For the first time, bells rang not only at canonical hours or special events, but at regular intervals, dividing the day into measured portions. Mechanical clocks quickly became symbols of power. Cities competed to build the largest, most impressive tower clocks. Rulers commissioned them to demonstrate wealth and control. Monasteries installed them to enhance discipline. Time itself became an assertion of authority. The bell that told the hour no longer depended solely on sun or priestly discretion. It was regulated by gears and weights, crafted by artisans whose skill represented new knowledge. For villagers, the effect was profound. Bells now tolled not just when the priest decided, but with mechanical regularity. Time was becoming less fluid, more regimented. Yet this new mechanical time did not replace older rhythms overnight. Farmers still worked by the sun. Peasants still judged the day by shadows. And many homes still had no clocks at all. The toll of mechanical bells added structure, but nature still ruled. The coexistence of old and new meant that medieval people lived in multiple times at once. The natural time of sunrise and sunset, the liturgical time of bells and prayers, and the new mechanical time of striking gears. Together, they wove a complex fabric of daily life. The story of time in the Middle Ages reveals a gradual shift. From shadows on sundials to drips of water, from candles burning to gears turning, people sought ways to measure the elusive flow of hours. The toll of bells unified communities, but the slow rise of mechanical clocks began to reshape how those tolls were understood. Time was moving from nature to mechanism, from rhythm to measurement, and in this shift lay the seeds of the modern world, where minutes and seconds dictate every action. But the story is not yet complete. For in the final section, we must see how bells and clocks together shape society, ordering labor, binding communities, and creating a new relationship between humanity and time itself. For most of the Middle Ages, time flowed with the rhythm of nature. Sunrise, sunset, the turn of the seasons. Bells rang to punctuate this flow, reminding villagers when to pray, when to pause, when to gather. But as mechanical clocks spread, the meaning of bells shifted. The toll no longer marked only sacred hours or emergencies. It began to measure life itself in equal segments. To live in a medieval town was to hear time transform from sound into structure, from rhythm into order. The bell was more than a call to prayer. It was a signal of work. In towns, the morning bell roused laborers. The midday bell called for a meal. The evening bell marked the day's end. These tolls structured labor in ways that written schedules never could. In fields, peasants still followed the sun. But even they paused when bells tolled from the parish tower. The sound carried authority, linking individual labor to communal rhythm. The bell's voice could summon workers to repair walls, fight fires, or gather for announcements. In this sense, bells function as the first communal timekeepers, binding villagers into a shared order. By the 14th century, mechanical clocks began to dominate civic life. Cathedrals and town halls installed great mechanisms that struck bells with reliable precision. These clocks were public, communal, and symbolic. To hear a clock strike the hour was to know that your town belonged to the new age of measured time. Cities competed for the most elaborate towers, each clock a symbol of wealth, pride, and technological mastery. A clock was not merely a machine. It was a declaration. We command time. For villagers hearing these strikes, life subtly changed. Time was no longer only fluid, tied to the sun and seasons, but now segmented, counted, and publicly declared. The arrival of mechanical time also brought discipline. In monasteries, clocks enforced strict schedules of prayer, making the rhythm of devotion more exact. In towns, bells struck at regular intervals, gradually training people to live by the hour. Artisans, merchants, and guild members began to regulate work more carefully. Meetings started at the stroke of the bell. Curfews were enforced by tolls. Markets opened and closed with chimes. This discipline marked a cultural shift. Time was becoming less about natural rhythm and more about obedience to measured order. To live by the bell was to live by external discipline, an early echo of the modern world's obsession with punctuality. Yet change was uneven. In rural areas, peasants still worked by daylight and seasons. Shadows, stars, and instinct remained their guides. Bells might ring, but the plowman's true clock was the sun. Even in towns, people resisted too much precision. The first clocks were often inaccurate, their gears drifting. Communities accepted flexibility, treating chimes as guidelines rather than absolute dictates. For centuries, natural and mechanical time coexisted uneasily, but slowly, the mechanical grew stronger. As clocks improved, their authority deepened. By the Renaissance, people increasingly lived not just with bells, but by them. Bells also kept their older role as markers of life's passages. Birth, marriage, and death were still announced by tolls. Funerals were accompanied by slow, heavy strikes. Weddings pealed with joy. The sound of bells stitched human lives into collective memory. Thus, bells held dual roles. They measured the hours of daily labor, and they sanctified the milestones of existence. No life was untouched by their voice. To live in a medieval town was to live with constant sound. Bells marked the hours, festivals, emergencies, and transitions. Their tones were familiar, embedded in memory, shaping identity. A villager could close his eyes and know the hour not by sight, but by sound. The bell was both clock and conscience. It ordered daily life, reminded of religious duties, and bound people together in a shared rhythm. To ignore its toll was not only impractical, it was socially unthinkable. The story of bells and early clocks reveals a deeper truth. Medieval people were slowly being taught to live by the hour. The toll of bells moved life from natural cycles toward measured intervals. The spread of clocks brought precision, discipline, and order.